Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all first for following instructions and coming directly to the gym. It's lovely to see you all so early in the morning. As you know, we have a special guest this morning, a gentleman who is both an ISB grandparent in the lower school and a professor of history emeritus from the University of Iowa. He was also somebody involved with the freedom marches in the 1960s. So it's especially exciting to bring him here to speak with you. And with that, I give you Shelton Stromquist.
Hey, it's wonderful to be here. You guys are terrific. And I'm really glad to know that you are studying about the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, that's such an important part of our history. And it's really important, even though it seems like ancient history, perhaps, to you, that it's really important for us to understand what went on there, because actually it really does have to do with our lives today. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So it's ancient history. To me, it seems like yesterday. You'll have to bear with me, because when I talk about it, I have a lot of emotion. It was a big part of my life. It really changed the direction my life took by being involved and having a chance to witness what was happening to people in the South. But there are kind of three things I'd like you to keep in mind and I'm going to basically tell you some stories from my experience. But three things that I want you to keep in mind. The first is that the Civil Rights Movement was a movement that was led by and initiated by African American people themselves. Even though I'm white and I came from a very different background, I've never been in the South before I went to Mississippi in 1964. But it was a movement that African American people in the South and in the North led. And they led it because they were trying to address the basic challenges that they faced of discrimination and segregation and oppression in this country. It was a struggle to win basic human rights, things that we all kind of take for granted. The freedom to move about where you want to go, the freedom to eat in a restaurant, or to ride on a bus, or to stay in a hotel, or even to drink in a drinking fountain where you wanted to drink. These were things that we take for granted, a lot of us, but in that time and in that place, those places, people didn't take that for granted. The right to vote. We're coming up on a big election in another year, and people are talking a lot about the vote. But the right to vote wasn't something that African American people in the South could do, basically. They were prevented from casting their votes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. This was a movement led by African American people. It was also a movement that was deeply committed to nonviolence. Have you guys heard the term nonviolence? Anybody? Who's heard the term nonviolence? Okay, yeah. Well, it's a way of acting, right? Not violently. But it's not passive. It's not just sitting and waiting, seeing what happens. It's active, it's proactive. It's really taking initiative, but doing so out of a spirit of love and a spirit of solidarity that will have a positive effect. And Dr. Martin Luther King, who many of you know the name, I'm sure, and we all celebrate his birthday now in January, spoke about nonviolence in very powerful ways because he was deeply committed to it. And when he was in jail in Birmingham, in the midst of demonstrations that were trying to desegregate restaurants and other public facilities, he wrote a long letter to white people who were skeptical about what African American people were trying to do. And in that letter, he talked about nonviolence, and I just want to read you just a short segment. Actually, he said, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open, where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil. You know what a boil is? A boil is a terrible sore that kind of is under the skin, but it's festering. Like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates. You know, so cutting open that boil creates a lot of tension. That exposure, with all the tension that its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. So that's really an interesting way of talking about nonviolence, because in a sense it's trying to expose the violence that's part of everyday life, but doing it in a non-violent way. But in doing that, sometimes it brings forth tension. So these are a couple of slides that I want to show you from the demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963. And these were demonstrations that were led by local people, but in which Dr. Martin Luther King was deeply involved. And they suggest the ways in which this nonviolent action, these young people, these are young people your age, who are in the streets marching for their rights, the ways in which that nonviolent action brought out a violent response on the part of the authorities. The police brought in police dogs, obviously, to try to intimidate and control the demonstrations. They brought in fire hoses to try to block people from demonstrating where they wanted to go. And they did other terrible things. And that's a part of this history that we have to come to terms with. So nonviolence faces fear, and you know, these kinds of demonstrations, people in them are brave, but they're also afraid. But they face that fear by acts of courage, by acts of public courage that are in solidarity with other people and encourage them to feel stronger in standing up to this kind of violence. The third thing I wanted to mention is that the folks in the South, the African American folks in the South who started these movements, at some point realized they were up against a power that was so great that they needed allies. And so they put out a call for people to come and join them and help them. And there's a term that I'm especially fond of. An old professor of mine used to use it a lot, and it's called accompaniment. And the idea is that in this kind of nonviolent action, you need a broader solidarity. You need people to accompany you, to share the risks, to share the fear, and to build the strength of the movement. And so, in Mississippi, well, first of all, and this is one of the really tragic parts of the story, that after the demonstrations in Birmingham, these 4 young girls were at church on a Sunday, and a bomb was planted in the church. And Denise McNair, Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, and Carol Robertson lost their lives in this bomb. Nobody knew at the time who for certain had planted the bomb. It was pretty clear it was intended to intimidate the community. And in the midst of their sadness and the tragedy, the community rose up and got even stronger with the memory of these young girls who had lost their lives. So much of what I want to talk about with you this morning is about the state of Mississippi. Anybody ever been to Mississippi? A couple of people? Yeah, okay. So Mississippi is in the very deep south. It was part of the Confederacy, part of the states that tried to secede from the Union and precipitated the Civil War. It was a state in which slavery was widespread, the enslavement of African American people. And in certain regions of the state, that enslaved population was particularly large. But after the Civil War, Mississippi became what some people then and more recently called a closed society. And it meant a society that was impervious to change, that was resistant to changing its old ways. And so segregation and the exploitation of African American people was deeply embedded in the state and in the culture of the state of white people. And so the state had some of the highest levels of violence that was exercised against African American people who dared to try to exercise their rights. Very high levels of poverty. Virtually nobody, no African American people had the right to vote. If they tried to vote, they were kept away from the polling place. The poverty was deep. It was a very appropriately called closed society. And so African American people who've been working to try quietly first and then more aggressively to change this society finally felt, you know, unless the rest of the country really understands how bad things are, nothing is going to change. We've got to somehow bring the light of day to Mississippi and make people realize how bad things are here for African American people. And so what the activists in communities around the state decided to do was to put out a call for people to come and accompany them. Now this is where that term accompanying comes in. To accompany them in their efforts to try to change this society. To share the risks and to share the work. And so that's kind of how I started to get involved. I was a college student. I came from a all-white suburb of Chicago. I had been off to college for a couple of years. I did some traveling, and I came back to the United States, and I said, you know, I need to join this effort. I need to be part of this. This is something I want to share. And so, this would have been in June of 1964, so more than 50 years ago. Several hundred people, young people like me, mostly white, but some African Americans, went to a place called Oxford, Ohio, for training, to try to prepare us for what we might be facing when we came to Mississippi. And the training involved, you know, was about a week long. We met in large groups. We heard talks by people who had experience in Mississippi, told us what it was going to be like. We did some role playing. We tried to pretend, half of us pretended in a small group, half of us pretended we were a mob, and the other half were people who were trying to register to vote. And so the mob part would start hitting them and kicking them, and not totally hard, but at least to give them a sense of what it might feel like and how to protect yourself if you were attacked in these kinds of circumstances. And so we went through a week of this kind of training, steeling ourselves, learning about Mississippi, learning about what this might be like, and then preparing ourselves to go. We talked about it as a kind of D-Day, a kind of invasion. And people in Mississippi were also white people were talking about it as an invasion too. And they said some pretty awful things that they were going to do to us when we showed up. And unfortunately, terribly, tragically, some of that was borne out in the violence that was taken against people who were part of this. So some of these photographs show us in the training sessions. The man in the left picture in the center is a man named Andrew Goodman, and I'll talk about him in just a second. He came from New York, actually. Group of people lined up, getting ready to get on a bus to go to Mississippi. And then in Mississippi itself, a freedom school, and I'll say a word about that in a minute, where young African-American kids who were out of school for the summer but who were going, during the school year, were going to segregated schools where they were in very crowded conditions, had practically no books to read, and just a terrible learning environment. And so the freedom schools were kind of alternative to that, to try to learn something about African American history, for instance, which was not taught in the schools. And then the final picture down here is of a volunteer, a summer volunteer, working with a couple of people trying to help them prepare to go down to register to vote. So I mentioned Andy Goodman, and Andy Goodman and two other young men, James Cheney and Michael Schwerner, were part of the group that I was in at Oxford. And we all left about the same time. They left a little earlier than I did, but when I got to Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is on the Mississippi River, when I got there, after driving all night and all day, the people I was with and I learned that they, who had gone a few hours before us, had disappeared. And no one knew for certain what had happened to them. It turned out later that they'd gone to investigate the burning of a church that was going to be used for freedom, excuse me, for freedom summer activity, for voter registration training and so forth. They'd gone to investigate the burning of this church. And we later learned from all the investigations they'd been intercepted by members of the Ku Klux Klan, and they'd been killed. So right off the bat, and these are two of the sheriff's deputies that were involved in the killing, as it turned out. They don't seem too displeased with themselves. They eventually were acquitted in a local court, but did go to trial in a federal court and were convicted, not of murder, which they had done, but of violating somebody's civil rights, which they had also done. But that was the federal charge under which they could be charged. So we started out under a cloud, in a sense. The worst thing we could imagine had happened. Our friends had been killed. And so we gathered ourselves together. People in the community were unbelievable. They took us into their homes. They fed us some of the best food I've ever had. They helped us get oriented to the community and what we were going to do. And then we started the work, which was initially at least to try to help people prepare to go down and try to register to vote. Now people knew pretty much that if they tried to register to vote, they were going to be turned away, or they were going to, worse, they might get beaten up on the courthouse steps, or they might lose their jobs because somebody had seen them going to try to register to vote. It took tremendous courage for people to do this. So this picture gives you a sense of an individual African-American woman, older woman, going up the courthouse steps to try to register to vote, and hanging around the courthouse were all these white people who were really determined not to let her or any other people in the community get the right to vote. And what happened when she went inside? Well, what happened was that she was confronted by the guy who ran the registration. It's called a registrar. And he immediately started asking her impossible questions to answer. Things that nobody could answer. Like, recite to me paragraph 32 of the Mississippi State Constitution. Right? Who's memorized the state constitution? Who has any idea what's in paragraph 32? You memorized it, right? I saw a hand there. Yeah, otherwise, yeah. Most people haven't. And so the whole idea was, you're not qualified to vote. You can't possibly vote because you're not qualified. And so people would get sent away. But they did this at some risk to themselves and to their families. In Vicksburg, we started a newspaper called the Vicksburg Citizens Appeal that was designed as an alternative to the existing newspaper that was being published by white publishers, and which didn't cover any of the activities the civil rights movement was doing. And so this particular issue is reporting on a couple of things that I wanted to point out to you. One was the FDP stood for Freedom Democratic Party, and the idea was to create an alternative to the all-white Democratic Party that would allow African American people and whites to participate freely, to have a voice. And then down at the bottom, I think you can probably read it, is a headline that says, 3 local Negroes beaten, all have worked for FDP. And this was, again, for me, a very painful story because it was something that I was directly involved in. We had, one of the people I worked closely with, and I'll show you a picture later on of him, his name is Willie Johnson. Yeah, Claire, okay, go ahead.
So was this made by the FDP?
The newspaper?
Yeah.
Well, it was produced by people in the community with help from white people who came down. Yeah.
Why would they say Negroes? Because that's kind of offensive.
Well, it is offensive now. It's an old term that is not used now. But at the time, the term Negro was the term that everybody used. So today we now say African American, and that's more respectful. At least we feel it's more respectful. I don't think necessarily people then felt that the term Negro was disrespectful, but it became so after. That's a really good question. So you know, basically I have two other stories that I want to share with you before my time runs out, and then I want to get your questions. But this particular reference, that article about 3 local Negroes being beaten, this was a case where one of the young men I was working with from the community, his name was Willie Johnson, and I had gone to visit a husband and a wife. He was a church deacon, and they were very active in the church out in the rural area of Warren County, where Vicksburg was. We'd gone to visit them to see if we could, with their help, arrange a meeting in their church to do voter registration training, and also to eventually hold a Freedom Democratic Party caucus meeting. So we were driving to meet them in their home, toward their home. And Willie was African American, I was white. We were sitting in the car together, and we went down the road, a pickup truck passed us, going the other way with 2 white people in it, 2 white men. And we could see that they looked long and hard at us. What were we doing? Anytime you saw an African American person and a white person riding together, particularly younger people like we were, then immediately they suspected, oh, these have got to be civil rights movers. So we realized they had seen us, and we sped up. We knew where the house was, and we raced up the driveway and drove in behind the house. It was kind of on a hill, right at the T of an intersection. And we got out and were greeted by Henry Collins and his wife Lucy. And we all looked out as we were going into their house and saw this pickup truck coming back, making the turn and looking very hard at their house. And so we thought, no, they know we're here. They know we've come here. They know that Henry Collins and his wife are involved. But we went ahead with our meeting. We arranged to have the meeting in a few days at the church. They were very helpful and very enthusiastic about it. The next day, we got a call that a truckload of Klansmen in their white robes had showed up at Henry Collins' house. And they what the article reports is they dragged them out onto the yard and beat them up with rifle butts. They didn't kill them, but they hurt them pretty badly enough that they had to go to the hospital. But what I want to convey is these are the kinds of risks that people were taking and were prepared to take, because they saw that they were living in a moment when the possibility for some real change in Mississippi might actually be happening. So there were other incidents. We got chased by cars. One night we were sitting on the front porch of our Freedom House, which was our kind of headquarters, and suddenly a car came by and we saw a flash of light and heard gunshots and hit the deck and realized that they had shot onto our front porch and later found the bullet holes in the siding. I never got beaten up. I never got thrown in jail. Vicksburg was somewhat more of a protected area than was some other parts of the state. If I went back to the map, the delta along the Mississippi River was a really dangerous area. So one other thing that I wanted to tell you about, and this was one of the highlights for me of the whole summer. We prepared really hard, we organized really hard to have these meetings all over the county to elect delegates to go to a county convention and eventually to the National Democratic Convention to represent the African American people of Mississippi. And so we organized these meetings all over the county. And it came precinct day. And so we had one meeting after another. We were hopscotching, from one meeting to another in our cars and, running late and so forth. One of the meetings that we organized, the last meeting of the day, was in a plantation area of the county. And by plantation, I mean these are large land holdings that are owned by white people. And African American people don't own the land, but they work on the land as sharecroppers. And they're very much under control of the white landowner. And he can, at the drop of a hat, kick them off the land, or worse. And they lose their livelihood, they lose their ability to support themselves. So to organize under those conditions is a pretty risky thing. You take a lot of risks to organize a meeting on that plantation land. But people there had said, yeah, we want to do it. We want to have it in our church. Our church was on the plantation land, and we're gonna be there. So Willie Johnson, the guy I mentioned before, and I were racing to get there on time. And by the time we got to this church, because we'd been to a whole series of other meetings, it was a half hour after when the meeting was supposed to start. And we drove up to the church. There wasn't a car around, nobody in sight. The church was empty. And we thought, oh, no, I guess it's not going to happen. It's just too much of a risk for people to come out to a meeting in broad daylight in the middle of this plantation. And so we got out of the car and we looked around and we were about to get back in the car. And I thought I saw some movement in the trees nearby. I didn't know what it was. At first I thought, whoa, this might not be good. But soon a few people started coming out of the woods, down the road. A few cars drove up, and suddenly we realized people were coming to the meeting. But they had waited. To see if we would show up, because they weren't going to take the risk of coming to a meeting that didn't happen. But once they saw that we were there, they said, okay, we're going to have this meeting. And so they flooded across the fields, up the roads, they filled the church. The most excited meeting we had all day. A lot of enthusiasm, a lot of singing of songs and of freedom chants and so forth. And it was really a kind of an amazing moment of people. I'm getting a signal that I'm running out of time. That's my point. That's it. One other thing, this is our Freedom House. You might not recognize it as a house. So after the summer was over, after we had all these meetings, after we had this really enthusiastic response to organizing the Freedom Democratic Party, in October, I was actually back at college, and I got a phone call early one Sunday morning. And the phone call was they bombed the Freedom House. And so what had happened was some white guys in the middle of the night had crawled under the house. It was a house that was up on stilts. They crawled under the house and they planted a dynamite bomb, a very powerful dynamite bomb, in the center of the house. No one was killed. There were a lot of people in the house. No one was killed. People were injured by flying glass and so forth. Amazingly, no serious injuries. But what the bombers didn't know was that they had planted the bomb right under the Freedom Library. And the Freedom Library was boxes, the shelves were all filled with books that had been donated from all around the country for the Freedom Library. But we also had way more that could go on the shelves. And so stacked from floor to ceiling were boxes of books. And the bomb was under those books. And the books literally saved lives because they absorbed the concussion of the bomb. So we were lucky. We were all lucky that there was no serious loss of life. So what did all of this, the civil rights movement this was just one moment in the civil rights movement. The Selma marches, which you've heard about and some of you are studying, happened the following spring. I was back in Vicksburg the following summer. And then there were other marches and events going on. And gradually, some things began to change. Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, and the federal government came in and said, we don't trust state and local officials to register African Americans. We're going to send in federal registrars to do it. And so suddenly, voter registration among African American people shot up from virtually 0 to 60, 70, in some cases 80% of the eligible voters registering to vote. They began to elect local officials. This was the site today, in 2014, the site of the Freedom House. These were two of my buddies from the civil rights movement when I visited them back in 2014. Henry Hunter was actually in the house when it was bombed. He's on the left, and he tragically just died a couple of months ago. Johnny Ferguson, who's in the center, I worked really closely with. And Johnny was elected to the County Board of Supervisors after the passage of the Voting Rights Act and after the beginnings of this kind of change in Mississippi. So some things did change. There were black elected officials like John Ferguson. There was some desegregation, significant desegregation of schools and of public facilities, restaurants. It came to be that you could go, an African American person could go to any restaurant they wanted, stay in any hotel they wanted. And there weren't those same barriers. The drinking fountains, the segregated drinking fountains disappeared. But some things didn't change that much. Some things didn't change. The economic inequality, the day-to-day experience of injustice in people's lives, particularly economic injustice, continued. And this was John Ferguson again on the right, and Willie Johnson, whom I've been talking about, that I worked closely with at the celebration of Willie's recovery from some serious surgery. But a lot of really strong bonds were built in that community and across the country behind this campaign. And although there's a long way to go, and you probably hear a lot today about voter suppression. Is the word voter suppression familiar to you? Do you know what that is? Yeah, it's essentially trying to keep people who should be eligible to vote from voting. And a lot of it is people of color, but a lot of it is also young people on college campuses who are being denied the right to vote in various ways. And so that fight to make voting rights real is still a very big fight. And voting rights connects to everything else in a certain sense. Climate change, I'm sure a lot of you are really concerned about climate change, but if we don't have the right to vote, our tools for fighting climate change are less. Economic inequality, better educational opportunity, equal treatment regardless of race, gender, or sexuality, all of those things depend on the right to vote. So the fight to maintain the right to vote is a fight for your time. It's a fight for our time today. And I think it builds on this tradition that we all can be thankful for, of people standing up in the 1960s and fighting for these rights and establishing them to some degree. So that's it. I'd be happy to, with the time we have. One more slide. This is the march to Montgomery, the Selma to Montgomery march for voting rights that made such a difference. So anyway, if you have questions, I'd be delighted to try to answer them. Don't be shy. I know it's hard to be group to ask questions sometimes, so know what to ask. Yeah. You know, I didn't personally think. The question was, did I witness any beatings or violence of that kind? And I didn't. In Vicksburg was a sort of, I mean, you know, we had a picture of a bombed Freedom House, so it wasn't entirely protected from violence. But the kind of day-to-day violence of people being stopped on the street or beaten up or thrown in jail did not happen so much in Vicksburg. It's a kind of bigger city. And so, you know, there are kind of other influences that kind of dampened the violence there. But I certainly knew people who were very badly beaten up. Yeah.
How many marches and protests have you been to?
How many marches and protests have I been to? Wow. There were some big and memorable ones. I mean, not that they weren't all memorable in a certain sense. And I've continued to march. I mean, in later years, I was very opposed to the war in Vietnam, and was very, was trying to support minority people in all kinds of contexts, immigrants and others. But I guess the most memorable other march, besides the marching that we did during the summer of '64, was the Selma to Montgomery march. Now, I didn't march from Selma to Montgomery, but I was part of the effort to march after some very terrible violence. And some of those of you who studied the civil rights movement may have seen images of John Lewis, who's now many years a congressman from Atlanta, who led a march across the bridge in Selma to try to go to Montgomery and demand voting rights. And he and those with him were terribly beaten up. And so 2 days later, they were going to have another march. And I flew down to Atlanta with some friends in the civil rights movement. We drove to Selma and were part of that next march. We didn't get beaten up that time, but we had some pretty scary encounters. But yeah, and then the James Meredith march. There were others. Yeah. I need to look this way too. Yeah.
Why did you choose the side that you were on?
I'm sorry, my hearing isn't that great.
Why did you choose the side that you were on? What motivated you to help
How did I decide?
Yeah.
Whoa, that's a really good question. I guess for me, a lot of it, there are two things that have come immediately to mind. One is that I had a mother who was very committed to social change and who was part of the teachers union in the town that I grew up in, and was very, very clear that even though she lived in a white suburb, that African American people had equal rights, and she was prepared to demand those equal rights for everyone. What was the other thing I was thinking of? That there was particularly, I know what it was. So I dropped out of college for a year before all this that I'm talking about now. And I was in India for a while, and then I was in Europe and Germany, and people kept asking me, what is going on in your country? Why are African American people being treated the way they are? And here I was, an American, out of my own country, and I was having to, I couldn't explain it. I couldn't justify it in any sense. But I got a perspective on my country by being outside of the country that in a way I didn't have as much before. And so I came back with a determination, you know, this has got to change. People have to change this. And I want to be part of that change. And so that, I mean, those are the two things. There were probably other influences. Let me go over here. This is something. Yeah. Yeah.
How much did these experiences affect on your daily life?
How much did these experiences affect my daily life? You mean now or and since? I think they had a pretty powerful effect in kind of choosing the direction my life would go. I mean, I continued to be involved in social change efforts of various kinds. I mean, today, Ann and I both work with a group called the CWJ, the Center for Worker Justice. So we're working with undocumented immigrants who are being harassed by ICE and by the federal government because they don't have documents. And so we're trying to, again, going back to that term accompaniment, be part of that change. And various other kinds. I mean, I feel like it's really made a huge difference in the direction my life went. And so what I taught at the university was about labor history, which was about workers and about workers' efforts to unionize and to make their lives better. And so I felt very strongly that was an important thing. Yeah?
Did you receive any criticism or backlash for marching with the African Americans?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, not so much to my face, but my parents certainly did. So during this summer, when I was in Mississippi, they got some hate mail that was unbelievable. I mean, some of it has been published in a book now, along with other documents from Freedom Summer. But the most vicious, hateful things you can imagine. I mean, one person wrote to my mother saying, you know, how could you raise somebody like this who would go down and do these things? And I hope the same thing happens to him that happened to those 3 civil rights workers who were killed.
Oh.
Yeah. So there was lots of hate in the air, and it was, some of it was directed at us, a lot of it was directed at our families and our parents and other people. Yeah.
Were you ever worried you were going to get seriously beat or killed?
Oh, I think I worried about it all the time. Yeah. I mean, you never, you know, yeah. I mean, this is kind of the reality that African American people in the South were living with since slavery times. You know, you step the wrong way, you be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you cross somebody inadvertently, you bump into them accidentally on the sidewalk. I mean, anything could happen. And so you kind of live with a fear always kind of there, but you try to control that fear so it doesn't immobilize you, it doesn't keep you from doing stuff. But it's always there. And, you know, because I'm not black, I didn't experience it in the same way that African American people did on a daily basis. But I certainly felt some of that fear. Yeah.
While you were marching, did you ever experience violence or witness violence while marching?
Yes. So I mentioned the James Meredith March. James Meredith was a young man who tried to integrate the University of Mississippi in 1962. And when he tried to do it, riots broke out on the part of white students and white people in the community. And John Kennedy, who was president at that time, sent in federal troops to try to protect James Meredith so he could register for classes at the University of Mississippi. Well, 4 years later, James Meredith was, by now, out of school, and he said to himself, some things have changed in Mississippi, but a lot hasn't changed, and I need to try to bring attention to it. So he started marching with a sign, the length of Mississippi, down the interstate highway. And as he got partway down, somebody in a field or in a woods nearby fired a shot and didn't kill him, but shot him and disabled him. And so at that point, other people in the civil rights movement said, we're going to continue that march. And so I had just graduated from college, and a friend and I who had been involved in the civil rights movement said, we're going to go down there and join the march. So we did. We joined it in Greenwood, right in the heart of the Delta, and we got to a town called Canton, which is, also in the Delta. And as we were assembling for a rally, the state police and the local police lined up and started firing tear gas canisters into our midst. And these are metal canisters, and so people were getting hit with the canisters and knocked out and injured pretty badly in some cases. And the tear gas was, I'd never experienced tear gas before, but it was pretty overwhelming. You just can't breathe in the middle of it. And so we sought refuge and we regrouped and eventually tried to have our assembly, despite the attempts of the police to suppress it. That's the first thing that comes to mind, but yeah.
So last year I didn't hear on the Civil Rights Movement.
I'm sorry, my hearing is pretty bad.
You learned about the Freedom Riders?
Right,
The buses like.
right.
Were you part of that?
I was not part of that. I had started college in 1961, and so I was at college when I was just beginning college, when some of the Freedom Riders came back and were telling their stories. The Freedom Ride, he was asking about the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were an attempt to integrate the interstate bus system, the Greyhound buses, and integrate the facilities, the stations where the buses went. And they were met with terrible violence. I mean, there are graphic images of buses being burned that they were riding on, and of people being very badly beaten up. But no, I was not directly involved in that. That was sort of a catalyst for me beginning to think, this is something I think I need to get involved in. Yes?
Was the press really not by the racist people?
Right. Well, you mean the national press?
Yeah.
Yeah. If they had known the term fake news, they would have said it's fake news. So she's asking, was the national press, were the white people in the South angry about the national press? Is that right? And the way they were covering it? Oh, absolutely. Because that, the whole idea of this effort, not the whole idea, but part of it, was to try to bring national attention to what was going on there. And so the state was crawling with reporters and news channels that were covering what was going on at the local level and around the state. And so it was exactly what the leaders of the movement had hoped would happen, that there would be this huge amount of attention, a spotlight, so to speak, right on Mississippi, and that the rest of the country would realize, oh my God, this has been going on in our midst and we didn't know about it? Wow. We've got to write our congressman, we've got to do something, we've got to support this effort. So exactly, yeah, I mean, and the local politicians and the local press were very upset by this kind of effort. Yeah.
Did you know any policemen from Mississippi that were for the Civil Rights Movement?
No, I can't say that I did. I didn't actually know any policemen at all, except, to sort of see them in a kind of unfriendly environment. But no, I mean, I don't want to suggest that there. 1 minute, okay. That there wasn't any quiet support among some Southern white people for what was going on. There were some Southern white people who were not happy with the direction that their society was taking, and were kind of sympathetic, but they were afraid too. They were afraid to stand up and be heard and to speak out. And so, we didn't get a lot of active support from local white people. How about you?
And so, was there at any point any type of private police or FBI type of thing that was helping the civil rights?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we always thought, not the local police, but we always thought that the FBI ought to be on our side, right? They ought to be trying to prevent this kind of violence. And in fact, there were laws on the books that said, if a police officer or an FBI agent saw someone's civil rights being violated, like being beaten up, they had the power to intervene and stop it. But in reality, that didn't actually happen. And the FBI was way more passive than we wanted them to be. One of the buildings that we wanted to use in Vicksburg, a community center for voter education, was burned to the ground. And we investigated it on our own and found that there were gas cans around, and clearly it was an act of arson. But we couldn't get the FBI to look into it. They were looking into some things, but they were not as active as we thought they should be on behalf of the civil rights movement. We need to stop, yeah.
As I started out by saying, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Stromquist here. I was born when this was happening. I was born in 1965. I've been fortunate enough to meet a number of veterans of the marches and know them and even work beside them. I've also been lucky enough to see Holocaust survivors speak and to meet them. As you grow older, you will hear people deny that these things happened. There are people who deny that the Holocaust happened. There will be people who deny that African Americans were treated so poorly back in these years. So you are fortunate that you are hearing firsthand about how things were back then, and I hope you will remember this day. And thank you again to Dr. Stromquist.
Go out and change the world yourselves. We're counting on you.